Hello old-timers and newcomers, I am Core Scratches, returning to you after a long absence and the start of a new year! 2022 had one last turn to give us with the unfortunate passing of Ruggero Deodato, director of the very first movie I reviewed, Cannibal Holocaust. I figure what better way to start this year off on the right foot, and to honor the man's legacy, than by re-examining this highly infamous staple of horror, grindhouse, documentary, found footage, mockumentary, commentary, and whatever other niche was fiddled in making it. Well, there was a documentary about the making of it about a year ago, but that didn't have me in it. If you're an old-timer and have been around since I reviewed Cannibal Holocaust, I'm surprised you're still watching me, because I think that review can be used as a convincing argument for eugenics. I was still figuring things out with very little idea of what I was doing, and my camera presence... It's not as common or widespread as this movie suggests it is. Just put the animal down, Deodato could use it for a prop, nobody would complain. I'd make tea and use it for kindling if I could. But, now knowing what not to do, I can give the film the proper review that it actually deserves. And this time I can make jokes that are actually funny. Beautiful sweeping shots of Colombia's rainforest, interspersed with the concrete jungle of New York 1979 greets us, accompanied by the haunting beauty of Ruggiero Ortolani's iconic background music. And if anyone tells you this movie has no artistic merit, tell them Ortolani worked on it. 2013 he received a Lifetime Achievement Award for his work in cinema. And his music was heard as recently as Django Unchained, and his most famous composition, Ti guarderò nel cuore, became a worldwide pop sensation under the title More, covered by people like Frank Sinatra, The Supremes, and Nat King Cole. And if they mention anything else about the movie, here's what you do. La 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 la. The story is initially very simple. A documentary film crew has gone missing in the Amazon rainforest, and a small rescue team is sent to look for them, led by noted anthropologist Harold Monroe. Played by Robert Cummon, who I was surprised to find was a big-name porn actor at the time. Something which he later came to regret and blame for his lack of success as a mainstream actor. After making north of 100 pornographies. Anyway, about half the film sees Monroe on this journey, with very little of the plot progressing until he returns to New York. But it offers plenty of time to lay the groundwork for what gives the film its meat, literally and figuratively. Deodato was a big fan of mondo cinema, or world cinema. Think of it as the bastard child between exploitation and mockumentary. Mondo films were usually presented as documentation of reality around the world, showing things that are not traditionally part of civilized society and generally focused on shock and awe. Thing is, that kind of reality tends to be a little bit elusive, so what directors would do is they would stage a thing, or six, and throw it in with the actual documentary footage from around the world. That way you can show things like rape, bestiality, probably human sacrifice, without having to go through the trouble of digging up a culture which actually practices it. But that's okay because it's still definitely reality. Mondo cinema has rightly garnered critique for this approach to documentary filmmaking, exploiting the ignorance of its audience as much as the cultures it purports to represent. Not to mention, on the occasions it shows actual death and pain on camera, it's not exactly sensitive to those affected, human or otherwise. As I've understood it, Deodato wasn't interested in the function of mondo cinema so much as the uses of it. You know, staging footage and how to make it not look staged, and mixing it in with the footage that isn't staged. How to stage it, what to stage, and how to suspend suspension of disbelief, all to shock and horrify his audience.
If hellholes like this didn't exist, I'm sure you would invent them.
And you have no idea how true that will ring. As a director, Deodato's purpose was to guide the cast, cameramen, editors and every other person whose efforts would make it onto the screen to get the best performance possible from them. And he made sure we would believe their misery. Robert Kerman described Deodato as a sadist, psychologically abusing anyone who couldn't answer back, and completely apathetic to anyone's sense of comfort. The movie infamously contains 6 scenes of animals being brutalized by members of the cast. Gabriel York refused to shoot a pig when he was scripted to. Peri Pirkkanen cried off camera after butchering a turtle, and several of the cameramen vomited upon filming the indigenous people kill a squirrel monkey by cutting its face off. All because Deodato said it had to be done. And speaking of the indigenous people, they were played by actual indigenous people, as well as a few prostitutes from a local brothel. And after directing them to run inside a straw building, Deodato forced them to stay in there as the building was lit on fire. And just in case the man didn't appall you enough, when Francesca Ciardi refused to bare her breasts on camera, Deodato screamed at her off stage until she did.
Whereas I would give both my... well, let's say I would give anything to be somewhere else.
It's easy to say the crew could have just left if they were this bothered, but possibly aside from Kerman, none of them had actual careers outside of this movie. They either did what Deodato said, or they'd say goodbye to their dream careers. I get making that deal with the devil, and also they had to get on a plane to reach Colombia, another plane to reach the forest, and a boat just to reach the filming location. I'm not saying Deodato kept them prisoners, but I don't blame them for thinking he might have. So yeah, that's how Deodato managed to squeeze such convincing performances out of his cast and crew. No word on whether the skeleton was real or not.
Hey, Professor! I recognize these teeth!
How often were you in his mouth to know? Felipe Ocaña, tracker and escort of the lost crew, and fellow of the Professor's own tracker, Chaco, played by Salvatore Basile. Then they kill a coati in a scene that I'm not going to show. But you'll be happy to know, Kerman strongly opposed, begging Deodato to let the animal go and then storming off the set when he didn't. Just to come right the fuck back and film the rest of his scenes, and star in another 2 cannibal exploitation movies, including Cannibal Ferox, which some people argue is even worse than this one. For being so uncomfortable, he seems remarkably comfortable. And then they show a scene that I had a reaction to. Deodato, did you just force me to watch a brutal rape and murder for no reason? Yeah, I did. On that note, they couldn't find an actress to play the victim, so they had a member of the wardrobe department do it. And then didn't keep track on who the earth it was. I wouldn't either after that conversation. The perpetrator leads them to a Yakumo village, where they're met with cold suspicion and contempt. As if blamed for a great tragedy the villagers are barely able to express. There's also a lot of underage breasts on display, but it's okay, it's not in a sexual context, that's in a different scene. The offense is forgotten faster than Kerman's principles. A simple pocket knife is all it takes to get on the tribe's good side, and allow the troop to travel further inland into the blazing foliage of the Green Inferno, a bestial place harboring the far more primal Yanamomo and Shimatari tribes. Fun fact, the Yanamomo and Shimatari are real indigenous people that live in the Amazon, and neither of them practices cannibalism, at least not in the way this movie portrays it. So instead of inventing a fictitious people, Deodato decided to demonize an existing one. Hooray for artistic integrity! Murder, rape, butchery, gift, fragile peace between the well-meaning travelers and cautious tribespeople. It seems whatever horror was unleashed by the camera crew's presence, the calamity runs so deep the Shimatari only trust the professor and his entourage as far as they can throw them. But not being horribly murdered by the blackest people Deodato could face paint does give them enough leeway for the professor to try. Deodato is many things, but sexist is not one of them. There's a surprising amount of peni in this movie, including Robert Cummins. The professor decides to symbolically equal himself with the tribe by dropping trow and having a bath in full view of a school of underage girls who proceed to... You know what? Forget what they did. The important thing is it leads to this. Some badass folk art. Mystery solved, the camera crew is dead as shit. But they were still a camera crew, and those reels would be invaluable. Not just for the bereaved, but for anthropologists and audiences across the planet. Still, the Shimatari hold on to the canisters, terrified whatever power is held inside would be unleashed upon them again. But Professor Monroe has come to bargain. Americans know the rest of the world suffers a debilitating lack of freedom! Put your hands down, this ain't a hold-up, it's a disco. The firework was just to get their attention. The real gift is the tape recorder, on which he'd captured the Yakumo Peace song. A display of power and gesture of friendship so great, the Shimatari invites them for dinner. Yeah, bitch, you wanted to equal yourself, get in! Now, almost 40 minutes in, the plot proper can begin. Monroe manages to convince the Shimatari to part with the film cans that he may bring them back to civilization, and after all this kerfuffle, the studio execs offer to compensate him for his troubles by letting him host an upcoming exclusive, showing the content of the film strips to the world. However...
I'm not speaking as a scientist, but as a man on the street. This so-called documentary footage is offensive, it is dishonest, and above all, it is inhuman.
I've been glossing over some pretty awful things so far, and before I continue, let me just say, ignorance is bliss. Ruminate on that as I ease you in. This far, what transpired in the jungle has been left largely a mystery, and with the bestial practices of the tribes taking center stage, we've been left to assume the crew to be innocent victims. But the practicalities of Mondo cinema wasn't just an inspiration for the direction, but the keystone of the plot. Supposedly, Deodato conceived Cannibal Holocaust as a critique of sensationalism and corrupt news media, after a conversation he had with his son about the coverage of the Red Brigades in Italy. He found the reporting to put unnecessary emphasis on blood and violence, and suspected parts of the material to be staged, coming to the conclusion respected news outlets are allowed to exploit the public's repressed interest in blood and violence, even if they themselves have to provide it. People love to say Deodato set out to critique sensationalism with this movie, but not only didn't he write the script, Gianfranco Clerici did, he was asked to make this movie. Film distributors in West Germany reached out to Deodato and asked him to make a movie similar to Last Cannibal World, another movie he and Clerici worked on. And he already had this basic idea, so he ran with it. According to the man himself, he only intended to make a cannibal horror movie. It just so happened to become one of the most disturbing and significant movies in the history of cinema. Underlying intent aside, we can't dismiss the artistry with which it was put together. Deodato had been trained in cinema verite, a documentary technique that focuses on unscripted moments meant to capture unfiltered reality. The cameraman is a fly on the wall, recording actual human behavior and genuine moments taking place before the camera holder in the effort to capture truth, ugly and beautiful, in a way no decadent Hollywood production would. Should it sound familiar, don't find it strange. It's been known under many terms over the decade. Dziga Vertov called it Kino Pravda. Jean Rouge called it direct cinema. You and I, of course, know it as found footage. Purists will argue the differences, but in practice the only difference is the spirit in which the technique is used. At the time, this technique belonged to documentary filmmakers and seasonal vacationers hoping to preserve their memories, not large studio productions. If the camera was acknowledged, if it was held by shaky hands, if it filmed without a script or post-production, the audience knew they were watching something real. Add on to this the principles of Mondo cinema, mixing genuine footage with staged footage, and the overall impression is convincingly real. How convincing was it? Come on, we all know the answer to this question. 10 days after the movie premiered, the entire crew was arrested for obscenity and Deodato accused of murder because it was reported people actually died on screen. That is how convincing it was. Take all this into account when I say this is where the movie gets fucked up. Decide if you want to know, and then click the video off if you don't. Torturing animals and simulating butchery is one thing. It's another to see it truthfully. Having worked closely with Alan Yates, the director, the studio execs have an inkling of what was filmed in the Amazon even before watching the film. To prepare Monroe for what he may see, they show a brief moment of Yates' previous documentary, The Last Road to Hell, a depraved clip show of executions by firing squads, corpses of dead children left to rot on the ground, and piles of bodies mutilated by the oncoming military force. The face of war unveiled and monstrous, caught on camera for the world to see. Horrible truths presented, awful things for any human being to see. But the horror is not yet known. It is explained to Monroe that Alan Yates got that footage by bribing the soldiers to commit the atrocity. This is messed up in 4 ways. 1, it means the slaughter wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for Yates. 2, this is how Mondo movies are actually made. If the director can't find the footage he wants, he will stage it. 3, Deodato scripted a segment called The Last Road to Hell, but chose not to film it, instead using stock footage of actual executions of real-life human beings. Or this assembly of genuine mass murder is meant to prepare us for the nightmare we're about to experience. The blood flows slowly into the heart of darkness. The people closest to the crew either claim to hardly know them or describe them as Machiavellian beyond belief. It paints a picture far different from the well-meaning rascals we've come to know, and thus were made company in the jungle. Barely a minute passed before there's pain on screen, the infamous slaughter of an arrau turtle, the unnecessary squashing of a tarantula, culminating in the assassination of Felipe, the guide. A snake, a harmless boa constrictor, had been placed in his boot and allowed to bite him. In reality, boas are harmless. Kids keep them for a first pet. In this movie, they're vipers. Or at least I assume that's why they cut Felipe's fucking leg off. Either way, the snake is treated like the commander of an advancing army. Cut the head off, the body stops moving. And the feel-good fun continues when they come across a Yakumo hunting party cutting the fucking face off a squirrel monkey. Initially, I wondered if I could hold that against Deodato. From what I've read, the brains of squirrel monkeys is considered a delicacy to the tribes. But then I found out he did a reshoot of this scene because they didn't like it the way it looked the first time, so 2 monkeys had to have their faces cut off and brains scooped out. Now I hold it against him! And still we descend further. As a means to find the Yakumo, Jack Anders wounds one of them in the leg, and they leisurely follow him back to the village where they initiate the first human slaughter. Alan, played by Gabriel York, was scripted to shoot a piglet to initiate a mass panic in the village, only when it came to snuff, York refused. He claimed to have formed a connection with the pig on the journey there, and he was so struck by the screams he flubbed his line and they couldn't do a reshoot because they only had the one pig! Tell me how sad you think he looks.
Things like this happen all the time in the jungle. It's survival of the fittest. In the jungle, it's the daily violence of the strong overcoming the weak.
This is why I have trust issues. I'll say it right now, I think Alan is Deodato's avatar in the movie. Between the glee with which Alan maims and murders for the viewing pleasure of his audience, and Deodato being described as sadistic, uncaring and abusive, I am pretty sure Clerici based Alan on Deodato himself. Pulp fiction fantasy drivels from his mouth as he bemoans the savage state of the land and the primal people which populate it. But in reality, it excites him, so he all but forces him on the far more withdrawn Faye Daniels. Played by Francesca Ciardi, and I suppose if you could call any of these people innocent, it would be her. Since she's not participating in the slaughter, but she's still there. With them. Willing to accept what Alan, Jack and Mock get up to so long as it furthers her career. She's not memeing if you're brave enough with a turtle head, but I think she's well earned a full body penetration. The movie takes a detour for Monroe to contemplate the implications of justifying what the crew did by showing it to the world, together with female executive, played by Kate Wyman, and it's a little bit odd that such an important character doesn't have a name. I think other than the camera crew, the only person with more lines than her is Kerman. Stranger still when you consider that she was Kerman's girlfriend at the time. This is where the film's supposed commentary suffers the most, with Monroe launching into a confused stream of consciousness comparing what Yates and the crew did with breaking into one's home and putting their food in the toilet, desecrating one's cherished possession and profiting off their misery, instead of, pointing out how he fucking murdered and tortured and went goddamn Old Testament on them. Based off of the half-assed rationale Monroe comes up with, I'm willing to believe Deodato didn't actually meant to make any commentary. Because if it did, it only makes less and less sense the longer this movie runs. After all I've read, it's kind of funny to imagine Deodato was at all making a serious point with it. On the one hand, he was essentially commissioned to make an ethnocentric exploitation film for a market of repressed Germans. That's hilarious! And on the other, just the production of the movie invalidates the point it would have made. Aside from Deodato, everyone from actors to cameramen were appalled by what they were doing. And if the great public really is as bloodthirsty as the movie pretends, it wouldn't have been relegated to the underground markets and grindhouse cinemas. In my opinion, people see what they want to see, and there is enough subtext to give food for thought, but I think that's down to Deodato's skill as a director more than any profundity of the movie itself. And I have made every damn point I could to validate this movie. Can it end now? Nope. 20 fucking minutes to go. And it starts with a forced abortion. There's no context, no cause, no idea what happened between cuts. It just starts and the crew films as the Yanamomo tribe rips the baby out of a woman and buries it in the sand. Are you not entertained? I like horror, I swear I do, but Christ's sake, give me a point! I hate you. Forgive me for skipping ahead, I'll tell you how we got here. Monroe has finally decided he will not host a public display of these tapes. In fact, he doesn't want them validated by existing. He demands the broadcasters destroy the material, which seems incredibly dumb on his part, but whatever. He manages to convince all the executives to watch the rest of the footage with him, for them to understand what a monstrous thing it would be. Thus we're back in the jungle and the way Gabriel York described it, this was the most horrible scene for him to film. He described how when Chiarte tried to intervene, the stress and confusion pushed him over the edge and he took his frustration out on the tribal girl in his most honest moment on screen. His experiences with the film so traumatized him when he came back to the States, he broke up with his girlfriend because he was unable to touch her without reliving the moment. I can't actually show you how gleeful he seems in the scene, but I would like to show you something else. This is Man Bites Dog, another movie I've already reviewed. In it, one of the script writers is playing one of the characters, Rémy Belvoir. And even though he wrote it, he was so uncomfortable with the rape scene in this movie, he could barely perform. I actually believe Rémy, because he was so utterly ashamed, he couldn't hide it on camera. So yeah, that's how we ended up here. After the boys had their fun, they found a big stick and made a shish kebab. Oh, come on, I had to. It's an exploitation movie. I had to pay respect to Tenold somehow. And now it is finally time for vindication. The Shimatari attack en masse, and across 10 minutes of the light, the camera crew are all picked off one by one. Jack is pierced by a spear, mutilated and grilled piece by piece. Faye violated and stoned, bone by bone broken with heavy stones, leaving only Alan and Mark before finally the Shimatari catches up and strike Alan to the ground. And it seems the executives were okay with their employees brutalizing brown people, but when the brown people got angry they thought, you know what, let's maybe not piss off the entire planet by putting it on display in assumption there is a demand to see this. So the footage is destroyed, unless it's not, no changes made to the industry, and Monroe is left to wonder who the real cannibals are. Oh, and Mark was played by Luca Barbareschi. I couldn't find a place to fit that in here. It's over. It is done. Never again. I just got one more thing to say. The portrait this paints of Deodato is not a positive one. Between the abusive treatment of the cast and the senseless violence for the sake of violence, he seems like the kind of auteur most people would prefer to forget in the garbage dump of history. But I don't think we should pretend he wasn't responsible for one of cinema's mile markers. I'm generally very cynical when it comes to entertainers and actors. Their whole living depends on their ability to feign human connection. It makes it impossible for me to tell when they're genuine, and I'm never really shocked when someone's outed as a piece of shit. But I choose to be pragmatic about the whole thing. Boycotting Victor Salva won't make Jeepers Creepers less of a classic. The Shining didn't become a bad movie because Kubrick all but broke Shelley Duvall. You can punish a person for their actions, but when they do something that actually benefits people, at the very least you can keep the work they did for yourself. Cannibal Holocaust is the first found footage movie the same way Halloween is the first slasher movie. There was the Giallo Mysteries of Italy, Hitchcock's Psycho, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and of course Black Christmas, but Cannibal Holocaust utilized the technique and spirit of the genre in a trailblazing first that inspired other directors to make their own mark. We would not have movies like The Blair Witch Project, The Poughkeepsie Tapes, Paranormal Activity, or Man Bites Dog if not for Deodato. It seems to have been a fluke on Deodato's part, as very few of his other movies reached the heights Cannibal Holocaust did, but he will forever be remembered as the man who so gaslit the world, we actually thought people died for our entertainment. Whether he intended to or not, he inspired generations of creators to pursue their twisted fantasies, to thrill, move and experiment with the changing times, and keep us asking how to know what's real and the magic and terror that question brings. Thank you, Deodato. We owe you a lot. And thank you all for watching. I have been Core Scratches, and it is over! I don't have to watch this travesty for another 10 years! Dreadful as the experience is, in the end I think it was worth it. I learned a lot and I found a new level of respect for the genre I already love. Plus, it's always fun to poke holes in the movies make you go psycho crowd. Watching horror movies is not a sign of psychopathy. But let's keep an eye on the people making the movies. That's why I stick to reviewing them. I'm a good guy. Don't Google me.